I think sometimes we get used to the promises of God, and we have a tendency not to think about how awesome and amazing that God is at times. I'm standing here on a slab of concrete, brand new concrete. It's a part of a building project for a church. This wasn't even here over a year ago. Nothing really amazing about the concrete. Nothing really amazing about this particular piece of land. But when you consider the fact that it all started with a promise from God, it becomes more amazing. It becomes more significant, and it becomes something that we marvel at the work of God. What am I saying? This whole entire church that this particular slab of concrete is connected to comes from a move of God. Wasn't even here more than 50 years ago. But because there was a need for God's word to be spread in a city during a time like this, someone had to walk out on the promise of God to the pastor of this church. Step out on faith on that promise, trust that God is going to guide for them. And here it is, 20, almost 30 years later, the church is here, still living off the promises of God. Sure, it takes time for those things to come to fruition, but the promise of God is as sustainable and as firm as this concrete here that I just walked in on. I want you to think about that when you take a look at Acts chapter 27 and 28. Here you have this passage where the Apostle Paul is literally living his life on a promise from God. He is he is headed to Rome in a ship that is halted at an island called Malta. And while he's in Malta, he comes about some persons, some places, and some things that try to prevent him from moving on to the promise. And I want you to remember this as we read this passage. And that is, as you move on to your God-given destiny, and everybody has one, you move on to the promises that God has made in your life. What you will find is that there are some persons, some places, and some things that may indeed prevent you from reaching the promise that God has already laid out for you. So the question then becomes, are you willing to move forward on the promise that God told you? Let's read the passage here. Acts chapter 27, verse number 22 to 25 first. Then Acts chapter 28, verses 1 through 9. Here's 27. Listen to this. And now I exhort you, be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar. And lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God that it shall be even as it was told to me. Verse 24. Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar. Acts chapter 27, verse 24. All right, now let's read Acts chapter 28, verses 1 through 9. Watch this. And when they were escaped, then they knew that the island was called Malta. And the barbarous people showed us no little kindness, for they kindled fire and received us every one because of the present rain and because of the cold. And when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, there came out a viper from the heat and fastened to his hand. When the barbarians saw the venomous beast hang on his hand, they said amongst themselves, no doubt this man is a murderer, whom, though he has escaped the sea, yet vengeance suffered not that he live. And he shook off the beast into the fire, felt no harm. Howbeit they looked, and when he should have swollen or fallen dead suddenly, but after they looked a great while, they saw no harm come to him. And they changed their mind and said, he is a god. Verse 7, in the same quarters were possessions of the chief man of the island, whose name was Publius, who received us and lodged us there for 3 days courteously. And it came to pass that the father of Publius lay sick of fever in a bloody flux, whom Paul entered in and prayed and laid hands on him and healed him. So when it was done, others also which had disease in the island came and were healed. Acts 27 and Acts 28 is what I read. Here it is. There is a promise. There is pronouns. Correction. There are pronouns. And then there is a punctuation mark. The promise, the pronouns, and the punctuation mark. Watch this. The promise of God comes to Paul in Acts chapter 27. What God says to Paul through the angel is, Paul, you have to stand before Caesar. At this time, Paul is literally a prisoner. He is imprisoned on this ship headed towards Rome to stand in front of Caesar, and he's in prison because he's preaching the gospel. Paul, a prisoner, going to Rome. However, as this ship is sailing, what happens is it breaks down. You can read all this in Acts chapter 28, the later part of Acts 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28. And as he's sailing, what happens is the ship breaks down and the ship stops at an island called Malta. Well, before the ship goes down, people were in panic. They were saying, hey, listen, we're going to die. Listen, we're going to go down. Every one of us is going to perish. But Paul is calm in the midst of all this chaos. Why? Because the angel of the Lord told Paul that you are going to stand before Caesar. That's the promise. Paul's promise is he's going to be in Rome standing before Caesar. You see, what we learn from Paul is that you can be calm in the midst of storms and trial if you stand on God's promise. What are his promises? Well, you have to read his word and understand what he promises the believers. He says what? Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. He says, no weapon formed against me shall be able to prosper. He says, my God will supply all of my needs according to his riches and glory. So the truth is this: whatever situation is going on around you, whatever thing is happening, whatever storm or situation or thing that breaks down is going on, you can be calm in the midst of the sea because you are standing on God's promise. What is his promise? His word. And so Paul is calm, and he's able to make these audacious faith statements while he's in the middle of the sea because he trusts God. Do you trust God? Do you believe what he says? Do you trust his word? Now, the promise in Acts chapter 27 is, Paul, you're going to Rome. But the ship breaks down and falls apart in Malta. Malta is not Rome. Malta is the place where Paul encounters the pronouns that attempt to keep him from God's promise. We will have pronouns that attempt to keep us from God's promise. A pronoun is what? A person, a place, or a thing. And so in Malta, what happens is this. Paul comes across a place that was kind to him. The barbarous people, they were amazing to him. Paul and all of his company were wet, they were cold, they were feeling bad, but these island people, as it is described in some versions, barbarous and other places, they were very kind to them. They gave them fire to comfort themselves. They gave them things that they needed. So they made it real comfortable for Paul. The place of Malta was comfortable for Paul. Much better than where he came from on that slave ship. Much better than where he was going to, which is Rome. He was comfortable in Malta. That's the place. The people were kind to him. Now, the people did a couple of things that were kind of strange things that people do. First off, they said, well, Paul is either a criminal, a murderer, or he's a god. And what you'll find is that people, when they take their time to try to figure out who you are, they'll go through a series of things that they have been exposed to try to crunch you in their box. But after Paul proved that he wasn't a murderer, and they concluded that Paul was a god, then they begin to treat Paul, you get to feel, with such reverence. So the picture is the pronouns on this island, the place, and the people were treating Paul with some respect, much better than in prison. So that was encouraging in itself for Paul to want to hang out in Malta. You see, there's going to be people sometimes that make it real comfortable for you to hang out with them, to stay in a place where you're not supposed to. God said you're supposed to be elsewhere, but it's real comfortable because everybody in this circle appreciates me. Everybody here knows me. Everybody likes me, but that's not where you're supposed to be. And the devil's good at that. But there's also something else that happens here. The person, the place, and the things. There's an animal that bites Paul. It's a snake. And back then, the venomous snakes were death sentences. Paul was putting together a fire. The snake bit his hand. The snake, Paul shook off and just continued on like it was nothing. The reason Paul was able to do that was because he understood that even though this snake, which obviously harmed him, was there on his hand, he was not going to die because he still knows the promise of God is that he's supposed to be in Rome. You see, the thing is this. There are some things that are in your life. There are some things that happen to you. There are some things that kill other people that you are able to shake off as if they were nothing. Why? Because you understand the promise of God. Why do people have nervous breakdowns after they get divorces? Or why do some people try to commit suicide after they go bankrupt? Or why do some people have these wrongful emotional disasters or catastrophes when they are faced with common circumstances? Why? Because they're not remembering the promises of God. But you do. And this is why Paul makes this particular course of action. He begins to, he shakes this thing off that kills other people as if it were nothing because he understands the promise of God. You see, sometimes the pronouns in your life will do one of two things. They will try to make it, the enemy will try to make them so comfortable for you, that thing, that place, that person so comfortable that you don't want to move on. Or he may try to have something so dangerous that he tries to take you out right in the middle of the mess. Either way it goes, if you understand the promises of God and understand specifically what God says for you, you have nothing to worry about, and you too can move on in peace like Paul did. The promise, Acts 27, Paul, you're going to be in Rome. The pronouns that attempted to stop him was in Acts 28, verses 1 through 9. And at the very end of this, Paul heals this man named Publius. And as he heals this man named Publius, the father of Publius, other people begin to come to Paul and get healed. So he winds up healing a bunch of people on the whole island. The personal, unique thing that I really get excited about this is that Paul is using the very same hand that was supposed to kill him from the snake bite to heal people on the island. If you're willing to hang out with God, if you're willing to believe his promises, God will literally turn your mess into a message. And that message is not going to just be for you, but that message is going to be for the healing of all of those people around you. The divorce that was supposed to kill you now winds up being the saving grace for millions of men and women that are all around you. The time that the devil tried to take you out winds up becoming the very same tool that you use to heal other people around you. Devil, what you meant for evil, God turned around and made it good. No weapon formed against me shall be able to prosper. So don't get caught up in the middle of the circumstances. Don't get caught up in the situation or the incidentals. Later on, Paul goes on to Rome, and then he writes this Roman letter, and then he fulfills his passage, so he doesn't fall for the pronouns. He doesn't fall for the trap. But I want you just to be encouraged from this passage here, the person, the pronouns, and the punctuation mark. Meaning, when Paul was on Malta, that wasn't a period in his life. He didn't die in Malta. He didn't stay there forever. That was a comma. He moved on to Rome, and that was the next phase or the next sentence in the story. The next sentence in your story should be something that glorifies God. This situation that you're going through right now should just be a comma. God is going to write the next sentence of your life. And if you stand on his promises, I guarantee you this: your story will be greater than your pain is in this particular situation. Acts 27 and 28, the promise, the pronouns, and the punctuation mark. Lord, I thank you. I just thank you for this marvelous opportunity just to be here. And even now, Lord, just continue with your promises, Lord, as we even stand here in front of the part of your promise, which is for this particular church in this particular area. Lord, just continue to show yourself mighty and true. Continue to blow our minds with the marvelous and magnificent things that you have done. Don't let us fall for silly okey-doke stuff. Don't let us fall for comfortable things that the enemy tries to give us. Instead, Lord, give us your word. Give us your promises. Direct us to your word, the things that are specifically for us, so that we can know what to stand on. And we can know what your children have. We believe you. We love you. And we thank you. It's in Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen. Hey, that's all I have for you. Please take a close look at it. Acts 27, 28. It's really phenomenal, guys. But thank you so much. Barbara, Sandra, Mary, I appreciate you all being with me, and everybody else here who's going to look at this later on at some point, in your life. Thank you. Acts 27, 28. Hope you all were blessed as I was. I really appreciate it. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Stand on the promises of God.